So today's video is going to be on story, and I thought what better place to talk about story other than this historic library I found here in town. Every story has a beginning and a middle and an end, but the problem I think that many of us face is that we're trying to figure out how the story might end, and we haven't even opened up the book to figure out how it begins. So as I mentioned, I'm at this historic library that has all these really cool artifacts and sketches and maps on the history of Tampa, and I just thought it would be a really cool place. I think a place that's surrounded by not just so many books, but even just sketches and objects, artifacts that have a story to them would be a great location to talk about my topic. So as I mentioned earlier, where I said, you know, we're trying to figure out how the story ends and we haven't even opened the book to see how it begins. What I mean by that is we're already fabricating in our mind how certain things are how they're not gonna work. You know, you have an art, like an idea for an illustration or something, or you have a business idea or anything like that, and you're already kind of fabricating things in your mind on how that's not going to work, and you haven't even started the actual process yet. But the Bible says that we have the mind of Christ, so you want to try to avoid that negative talk that's just going to erode your confidence, and you want to focus on good things. You want to focus on a different way of thinking so that it doesn't completely stump you or stop or keep you from actually accomplishing or writing, drawing, illustrating the story that you want to create. When I start a new illustration, the first thing that I want to establish lies in a single question that I ask myself. What's the story? What message do you want to express to anyone who's going to look at this? Now, this doesn't mean that every piece of illustration that you do has to have a story. In fact, if you look at my Instagram, I have a lot of just character faces. I like drawing faces, and so I do a lot of that, and they're just easier and quicker to do. But if you want to create impactful art, something that's like memorable, those just tend to be things that have story to them, and it doesn't have to be super complex. In fact, a lot of times you want to make it simple. It could be very simple. It could be humorous. It could be adventure. It could be romantic. It could be many different things, but those tend to be the memorable ones. And this is what you would call narrative illustration. And there's two things that I want you to ask yourself every time you're going to do a narrative illustration. Number one, what do I want to say with this, or what do I want to express with this illustration, and what do I want the viewer to take away from it? Usually, you know, what do you want to say and what you want them to take away, they're going to be the same thing. It's just that when you think about it this way and when you actually write that down, it helps you keep your message as clear and as concise as possible. So once I determine the story, the message, that's when I start to research and I start to sketch. And when I'm sketching, I do many thumbnails, many iterations. I look through a lot of different books, different resources, just looking for inspiration, things that will help, whether I might look through anatomy books to maybe figure out pose if I feel stuck on a pose or something like that. But really, I'm looking for costume design ideas. I might be looking, if it's a vintage piece, I might be looking for different era, like a different vintage or architecture. But I also wanted to mention that I really like using video reference, which isn't often the easiest thing to find. However, what I like about video versus photo is that you can often get several angles, poses, and even shift in light that you don't really get from a static image. But during this process, there's something very important I want you to consider. When you're doing all these little sketches and these thumbnails, don't get fixated on your first idea. And in fact, sometimes my first idea is the best idea. Sometimes I draw something and then I do a bunch of iterations only to come back to that first idea because it was the best one. But when you do that, when you don't do other ideas, when you don't do other thumbnails, you miss out on just different explorations. Sometimes through that exploration, I've ended up coming up with something that I didn't originally think about in the first place. And it ends up kind of maybe switching my direction a little bit, or just making my idea more authentic, even better. So don't skip out on that. Do all the little thumbnails, do the research. When you do those things and you incorporate incorporate that into your drawing process, I'm telling you, it's going to make for a way more authentic, cool looking piece. The goal is to just keep pressing through and not be discouraged. I really like this quote from Ed Catmull. He was from Pixar, and he had this book called Creativity Inc. And in that book, he says, "Originality is fragile, and in its first moments, it's often far from pretty. That is why I call early mock-ups of our films ugly babies. They are not beautiful miniature versions of the adults they will grow up to be. They are truly ugly, awkward and unformed, vulnerable and incomplete. They need nurturing in the form of time and patience." So it's kind of funny. He talks about ideas as an ugly baby. Like, it starts off as this like ugly thing with no real good form or anything, and you just have to keep nurturing it and watering it and developing it until it eventually grows into something really awesome. So if you're an artist or an aspiring artist watching this, I want to encourage you to view yourself in this way. As an illustrator, you get to be the art director, you get to be the film director, you get to be the costume designer, the writer, the casting director, the light design person. You get to run the whole show, and that's really cool. You get to make a lot of the decisions on how your story, how your character is going to look like. I think this kind of thinking helps you get more excited to work on each piece. You know, this reminds me when I would go to Comic-Con shows, when I would table at them, and every once in a while, I'd get somebody to say that some of my art pieces look like a movie still. And not because it looks like this masterpiece or anything like that, but because of the lighting, because of the mood, it sort of had this cinematic kind of feel to it. But you have to work through the ugly phases in order to get to something beautiful. And this goes for no matter what you're trying to accomplish. I mean, if you look at flowers, butterflies, even bunny rabbits, you know, a lot of these things don't look very beautiful in the early stages of their lives or and things like that. But it just takes time, and eventually it blossoms, it flourishes into something really cool. You have to view your ideas in the same way. You have to really kind of just work through those difficult stages and know that if you trust the process and keep working through it, you are going to come out on the other side with something really, really cool. But in order to do this successfully, you have to be mindful of how you're thinking about this stuff. I want you to kind of think about it like this. Your thoughts can either be something that leads to wonderful creative ideas, or your thoughts can be a poison that kill your idea before it even sprouts. So don't let your thoughts poison your story. Don't let them keep you from writing or illustrating or speaking your story. There's many different ways to tell a story. Some of us tell it through art. Some of us tell it through dancing. Some of us tell it through like a podcast. But the way that you think could completely destroy that story. It could completely hinder you from finishing that story. It could completely hinder you from even starting it. You could go down that path, as I spoke about earlier, where you're fabricating already how it's going to fail before you even start it. So don't let those thoughts keep you from telling your story. You know, I really like this quote from Mark Twain. He says, "I am an old man and have known a great many troubles, but most of them never happened." Essentially, what he was saying is that he was worrying about things happening that never even happened. So don't let this happen to you, my friends. I pray that you continue to work on your story, whatever it is, and that you work through it, even through the ugly baby stage, into something really beautiful. Don't quit your story. Illustrate it, finish it, share it with everyone, and keep the fire alive, my friends.